The clock reads 2:23, and 3 Ukrainian FP-1 drones slip into Russian-watched waters at just 2 to 3 meters above the sea. They run near 180 kilometers per hour, hugging the Black Sea like shadows that refuse to throw a shape. Their heading is the same: a Russian spy ship sitting about 15 miles off Novorossiysk, calm and confident in its screens. For weeks, that ship has listened and logged, building a pattern of life to predict Ukraine's launch rhythm and kill the next raid. Tonight, the plan meets the limit of its own sensors, because speed at low altitude turns big systems into slow questions. Wood frames cool fast, sea clutter hides motion, and the first decision window closes before anyone can agree on what they saw. This is the opening move, not the whole story, and the board will tilt when attention shifts in the wrong direction. Stay with us as we track how seconds, meters, and angles decide the day before missiles do. If you want clear maps and field-level breakdowns without noise, like, share, and subscribe to Military Force. 3 FP-1 sea-skimming drones left the coast at 2:23, and they beat the first guard line by using wood frames, very low altitude, and a cool thermal signature. They flew at only 2 to 3 meters above the waves, and they kept a steady speed close to 180 kilometers per hour. That profile is hard to see because the radar beam keeps catching whitecaps while the target hides inside the same noisy picture. Plywood matters here, since it reflects little energy back to the antenna, and it cools to sea temperature in just a few minutes. When the skin cools, the infrared image fades, and the sensor has to guess whether a dot is a bird, a buoy, or nothing. Russia had a 4-post R on patrol with an MX-15D camera, and that optic can detect a 2°C difference at several kilometers. Even so, the contact came and went because the drone hugged the troughs and the background kept moving like a living wall. Sea clutter is the right term, but what crews see is simple. The screen looks busy, and small shapes blend with foam and spray. Doppler filters help in clean air, yet they struggle when everything on the surface moves and the target flies almost level with the water. Look-down geometry also hurts the spotter, since the line of sight cuts through thick humid air and loses contrast over distance. In that band, automatic trackers need a sharp edge or a strong return, and the FP-1 gives neither at that height. The camera operator zoomed, but the outline broke apart, because lens shimmer and salt haze distort fine detail near sunrise. Thermal video did not save the search, as the wood cooled into the ambient field and erased the heat cue from the casing. Only the engine remained warm, and the prop disc masked it from some angles, so the hot patch kept blinking in and out. Each blink shortens the decision window, and by the time the display refreshes, the drone has already crossed another kilometer. At that pace, one uncertain sweep is enough to lose classification, and the watchstander moves on to a clearer shape. Human factors add delay, because crews are trained to avoid false alarms, and they need confidence before calling an intercept. The doctrine rewards caution on faint tracks, but caution gives time back to the attacker who lives inside the noise. Low altitude also bends the engagement math, since guns and missiles prefer space to build a firing solution, and there was no space. A radar optimized for metal aircraft expects crisp echoes, yet wood gives soft returns that look like clutter to the algorithm. Pulse energy spreads, side lobes bounce off waves, and the processing stack demotes the blip to a low-value target. Every demotion reduces priority, and low priority means no vectoring to investigate a contact that might be a decoy bird. The FP-1s use this bias against the defender, and they stacked small advantages until the gap opened wide enough to pass. Nothing here was magic, only discipline and geometry, as seconds and meters replaced brute force with timing. The timeline proves the point, because the trio held height, kept speed, and refused to give the sensors a clean look. That is why the first layer failed without a shot, and why the operator's log showed only a doubtful streak near the horizon. Once the doubtful streak faded, the route ahead became simpler, and the strike package kept moving on script. With the first net slipped and the picture uncertain, the plan unfolded toward the piece that would pull the guard force off the true axis. The decoy fleet of 20 boats copied the look, speed, and radio voice of real naval drones, and that forced K-27PL hunters to sprint west and leave the spy ship without a shield. Each hull came from cheap commercial craft, yet the builders added simple controllers, steady GPS tracks, and antennas that whispered on the same bands used by Ukrainian strike models. Operators kept tight spacing at first and then spread into attack shapes, because realistic geometry convinces screens and crews far more than noise alone. The formation pushed at about 80 kilometers per hour, which is slow for aircraft but perfect for bait that wants to be chased. On Russian scopes, the picture looked like the largest drone push since 2022, and doctrine tells watch officers to engage visible mass before hidden risks. That rule matters under pressure, since commanders must choose quickly, and big flocks feel more dangerous than a few dots near the horizon. 6 Ka-27PL from Novorossiysk lifted with a standard load of fuel and RGB-16 depth charges, while 4 more spun up in Sevastopol to widen the search arc. Helicopters covered 100 kilometers in 20 minutes, which sounds fast, yet the sea is wide, and every leg steals time from the base. At 270 kilometers per hour, the fuel curve climbs and endurance shrinks, so each false turn cuts future options and trims the patrol radius. Crews flew racetrack patterns over empty water, dropped charges on ghost returns, and burned ammunition worth more than the price of several decoys. A single RGB-16 can cost thousands, and 1 flight hour on a Ka-27PL costs far more, while each dummy boat stayed under $10,000. This is cost imposition in plain form, because cheap bait drains expensive readiness, and drained readiness opens a window somewhere else. Radio operators aboard the helicopters tried to cue patrol boats toward hotspots, yet surface wakes and morning haze kept breaking the trail. The swarm helped that fog of war by transmitting clean but basic signatures, which fit the threat library well enough to pass first screens. Even cautious officers accepted the picture, since the signals matched known patterns and the spacing looked like a coached strike package. Chase behavior made the trap deeper, because the faster the helicopters moved west, the longer the return leg would take when the mistake surfaced. By the hour mark, the group stood roughly 180 kilometers off Novorossiysk, and half the fuel tanks were already gone. Maintenance planners at base would later face extra inspections on gearboxes and rotors, since hard sprints in moist salt air punish old fleets. Every unseen cost compound, and while crews chased decoys, the true axis stayed quiet and pointed east, where the priority platform held station. With air cover pulled away, the spy ship lost its quick reaction buffer, and the command post had no rotary wing to vector on short notice. Surface escorts could not replace that role, because jets cannot hover and boats cannot sprint fast enough to map wide water. The bait did not need to hit anything, since its purpose was to stretch the net, waste the charge racks, and steal the only tools that close the distance. When some decoys ran ashore and others circled until fuel ran dry, the picture finally cracked, yet the burn time was already sunk. Helicopter crews turned for home with low reserves, and the defensive umbrella over the eastern sector folded just when it was most needed. That is how a low-budget swarm changed the balance, because attention flowed west while risk grew east, and the real approach soon reached radar country. With the guard force off axis and the sky above the ship uncovered, the strike route narrowed toward the Podlet K1 corridor, where only a thin timing window could carry the attack forward. The FP1 team used the tiny phase gap between 2 Podlet K1 radars to slip through a low-altitude overlap, accepting navigation risk and extra fuel burn to stay inside the lane. They aimed for a corridor about 2 kilometers wide, where the sweep patterns did not fully cover the same slice of sea at the same instant. Each radar rotated at a steady pace, so the beams created a rhythm on the scope, and rhythm always leaves a seam for a disciplined pilot. The window worked like this: roughly 4 clean seconds to vanish in clutter, then 2 brief seconds when one dish could catch a trace. 4 seconds sounds small, yet at 180 kilometers per hour, the drone moves about 200 meters, which is enough to cross a narrow beam edge. To use that space, the crew locked heading, trimmed pitch, and held altitude so the hull stayed buried in wave return. Any wobble would push the track into the exposed slice, and a single bright sweep could trigger a higher priority mark on the console. Wind at low level added drift, so the controller made tiny rudder inputs because large corrections waste speed and grow the heat signature. The guidance logic filtered those inputs to keep the nose steady, while the engine ran near a constant throttle to avoid thermal spikes. One drone developed a micro error in its gyro solution and started sliding right, which turned a geometric problem into a fuel problem. The fix required a sharp turn back into the lane, and sharp turns cost range, since extra lift and drag drain the tank faster than cruise. The team still chose the correction because getting seen once would end the run, and dead reckoning alone might not hold the seam. After the hard offset, the drone had burned away about 12 minutes of useful endurance, trimming the time left for the final approach. That loss mattered, since the plan counted on a precise arrival window near dawn, when air layers begin to change and screens lie more often. Meanwhile, the other two held the center line and rode the 4 clean, 2 exposed cycle like a metronome, slipping past each dish on the offbeat. Podlet K1 is built to see low flyers, but it still needs cooperation from physics, and physics will not help when timing steals the look. The operator might notice a faint streak, yet doctrine calls for confirmation, and confirmation needs persistence that short blips do not give. Short blips also sort near the bottom of priority lists, because the system tags them as low confidence in seas with heavy return. While confidence stayed low, vectoring did not happen, and no patrol boat or helicopter moved to cut the lane in real time. Fuel math stayed tight though, since the margin for error shrank with every correction, and the column could not afford another hard turn. The crew watched distance to go and time to empty climb toward each other, and they shaved seconds by flying smoother instead of faster. A smooth profile wastes less energy, lowers infrared bloom, and keeps the track inside the darker band that radars often skip. Discipline at the controls turned a narrow opening into a passable route, and discipline at the throttle kept the tanks alive long enough. By the far edge of the coverage, the trio had preserved the plan, but the damaged drone now carried a clock that could not be reset. They cleared the radar country without a firm lock, which proved the lane existed, yet the cost and fuel would follow them to the target. With the midline behind them and endurance cut thin, the battle moved from geometry to electrons, as Russian units switched on GPS spoofing from Crimea to bend the path off course. GPS spoofing from the R330ZH Jatel bent the flight path of the FP1 group, but the Ukrainian crew fought back with cameras and fixed visual points on oil platforms. The fake signals were loud and clean, and they pulled the navigation fix a few degrees east as if the world itself had shifted. Spoofing is not simple noise, since it talks in the same language as satellites and offers a brighter lie to a hungry receiver. The operator cross-checked bearing and distance against preloaded coordinates and a printed table that sat inside the cockpit code. The numbers did not agree with the GPS plot, so the crew trusted the picture and not the spoofed map. They tapped a correction into the guidance stack and trimmed the nose back toward the planned course line. The drone kept speed while the engine held steady power to avoid a thermal spike that might betray the fix. The second FP1 still had a clean receiver, and it used the same visual method to confirm that its track matched the intended leg. The third drone was not as lucky because its GPS card failed and pushed the system into pure inertial navigation. INS alone drifts over water, and the error grows by about 10 meters per minute when the platform has no strong references. At first, the drift looked small, yet the gap widened as minutes passed, and the math pointed toward the empty ocean. The operator tried to salvage the run by shaving the angle and searching for a rig, but the camera saw only haze and wave tops. Without a reliable fix, distance to go climbed while fuel to empty fell, and the profile no longer closed the triangle to target. The crew made the hard call, and the wayward drone descended into the sea with no warhead event recorded. Losing one platform hurt, but the other two now had confirmed bearings and could ride the corridor with better confidence. They marked each rig they passed, updated the offset, and kept the compass stable enough to filter out lateral oscillation. Every visual update reset the position with human logic, which is slow but robust when the radio sky is full of lies. The team also watched for specular glare on the water, because sharp reflections can hide small shapes and confuse edge detection. The route returned to plan, and the eastbound leg lined up with the final approach geometry that was chosen for early morning. Fuel margins were thinner after the corrections, yet the timeline still fit the window when air layers begin to change. Each kilometer now depended on clean handoffs between the eye, the compass, and the corrected table of bearings. The real win was not a gadget, but a habit, since trusting a camera against a false sky saved the mission from a silent kill. With one drone lost and two back on script, the strike group closed on the sector where atmosphere would turn screens into guesses. And with the path corrected by sight instead of satellites, the approach set up the final run under the morning inversion that hides low shapes from busy radars. Morning fog grew thick over the Black Sea, and a sharp temperature inversion lifted radar beams upward, leaving anything below 30 meters in a blind band. A Project 03160 patrol boat finally gained a visual at 500 meters, and the gunner brought a PKM to the rail. Short bursts walked tracers across the surface, and 3 hits punched the plywood skin while 1 round clipped the propeller arc. The engine on the lead drone began to shake, and vibrations stole thrust, so lift died fast as the hull took on spray. The second FP-1 stayed quiet by design, and it flew dark, on minimal electronics, using a stable compass line and a fixed throttle. The sea still favored low shapes, since the inversion bent returns up by about 15 degrees, and the ship's navigation radar could not depress further. The drone's camera centered on the bridge roof, and the mast base held the cluster that mattered most, from R381T arrays to mineral elements. Range collapsed quickly at 180 kilometers per hour, and the closing angle denied the gun crews a clean lead. The pilot held 3 meters to keep the hull under the radar lobe, and the prop wash flattened the surface just long enough to ride the trough. At 7:30, the platform reached the outer ring, and the escorts were out of position because fuel checks had dragged them wide. The bridge team raised binoculars and shouted bearings, yet the field of view lagged, and the target crossed the last firing line. At 7:34, the FP-1 struck the mast base, and the blast ripped through the upper works, cutting cables and blowing panels from their mounts. Heat and smoke rolled over the bridge, and secondary arcs flashed as power supplies failed, which ended the signal picture in a single minute. Crew damage control held the hull, but the electronic eyes and ears stayed blind, which reset the pattern of war that had been closing on Ukraine. With the superstructure deaf and the quick reaction layer gone, the tracking chain on Ukrainian launch cycles broke apart and forced a rewrite of Russian procedures. That is why one low strike changed tempo on the water, because geometry, weather, and timing made the first true kill before any doctrine could adapt. And with the top of the ship burned silent, the fight moved to a new rhythm where initiative follows the side that wastes fewer seconds. Seconds, meters, and angles beat expensive sensors tonight, and a cheap decoy plan helped blind a command and surveillance ship. Ukraine mixed low flight, false swarms, and smart EW defense with a morning inversion, and that package opened a clean lane at sea level. The key window ran from 2:23 to 7:34, when 3 FP-1s stayed under 30 meters while 20 decoys pulled 10 K-27PL far to the west. This is cost imposition in real terms, because plywood frames and simple cameras forced high-priced assets to chase empty water. Doctrine will now change, since low-tier radar, faster QRF rules, and stricter decoy checks are the only path to close this gap. Ukraine will likely scale the human eye plus fixed markers method, because trusted visuals beat a noisy sky when spoofers talk loud. The next measure of momentum is whether the low layer gets thicker first or the strike rhythm gets faster again. For clear maps, sharp breakdowns, and field-level updates without noise, like, share, and subscribe to Military Force.